Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see faces of people I've met, and it's been so nice to meet people in the book club as I've been going around the country doing the Flourishing Project. And quite often I've had people come up to me and say, I'm in your book club. Um, we're a little bit of a smaller group tonight, which I'm kind of sad about. I thought more people would want to read this book than Donut Economics. But I also think that what I'm hearing across the country is that when we used to come back to church and regular church activities sort of immediately after Labor Day, that's transitioning more to be after Thanksgiving. And so I'm not sure everybody's back in the swing of doing all the church things quite yet. Um, I'm really, really excited to be joined tonight by my colleague in the General Counsel offices, the Reverend Cameron Fraser, who is our National Director of Growth and Ministry Development across the church. If you have heard about the growth animators that have joined, the staff in the national office who are working with growth and ministry development as a strategic priority of the General Counsel office in supporting our regions. Cam is the director that works with those growth animators. And Cam, do you want to say a quick hello and where you're joining from? Because I love your introduction of where you live. So
Yeah, hi folks. Yeah, my name's Cameron Fraser. He, him pronouns. I'm coming to you streaming live from the Regina offices of the United Church of Canada. If you weren't aware that the United Church of Canada had offices in Regina, they are also known as usually my dining room table, but today the porch of my house in the Cathedral neighborhood in Regina, Saskatchewan on Treaty 4 territory here in the prairies, and I'm super delighted to be here. And yeah, interestingly, that it's a scant turnout on a when we're talking about a book about the need for increased population. So we're kind of embodying like a full immersive experience, folks. Look at what you got here.
super. And I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat people in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory, just up the street from the General Counsel offices here in Etobicoke, Ontario. And if you would like, you can also put into the chat the traditional territories that you are joining us from tonight. Um, so I chose this book for the book club at the beginning of my term as moderator because a friend, somebody that I knew from work that became a friend, Tim Coldwell, who joined us to talk about, I think he had what book did he join? He talked about Andrew Winston's book, Net Positive. So Tim used to be the CEO of Chandos Construction and has now gone on to do his own thing. But every once in a while when I'm in Toronto, I go for breakfast with Tim, and this was a book that he had told me about, and about this sort of, because Chandos was really big into like building infrastructure and community assets. So they built a lot of schools, community centers, public pools, and then social housing. So this type of stuff is the stuff he was into all the time. And I thought, well, that would be a fascinating thing to read, because one of the things that he told me 3 years ago was that the government was really pushing on the down low for towards this 100 million number in terms of immigration, that there was an unofficial, or no, there's an official but like unstated policy that the goal was to get Canada to 100 million people by 2050. But that they don't talk about that often in public because it is politically fraught, as we see from reading the book. And so I put it on the book club book without reading it, and was really fascinated. And I was thinking, who would be a good person to invite to discuss this book with me? Cam's department, I think, sometimes has been pigeonholed as being the folks who are supporting like the very audacious goal we have to have 100 new communities of faith in the United Church of Canada, but a significant majority of their time is actually spent on ministry renewal and supporting our existing communities of faith with turning around the situations that they find themselves in. And because we have been such a unifying presence as the United Church of Canada across Canada from coast to coast to coast, I thought it'd be really interesting to have a discussion with Cam about the ways in which he and his team see this showing up and not showing up in the sort of micro level at our congregations. And so I'm really happy that you're here with us. And I talked about, Cam and I had a meeting 2 hours ago to talk about what we were going to talk about, and now I didn't write it down, and I'm still getting over this cold I've had for 3 weeks, and it's dropped like a stone in water. So Cam, do you want to just
Love to hop
I
in
know
there.
you will remember.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about was, we both really experienced how this book, and the way it lays out like the history of Canada, in relation to migration really, really changed, and challenged many assumptions that we had, learned in social studies or history classes. I can remember thinking of whether it was a teen or a young adult, considering Canada's smallness, vis-a-vis population, is sort of like a quirky thing, but like kind of like fun, like feeling it was sort of like this strange source of pride. Like I remember like there's an arrogant worm song with a line about Canada. Canada's really big, and there's a line they do a little line about each province. And the line about Manitoba was Manitoba's population density is 1.4 people per square kilometer. Isn't that how awesome? And I remember thinking like, that's awesome. Like what a weird and interesting thing. And that there was a cost, or a downside to that thing would have never dawned on me. And I feel even like it was virtualized, in my growing up. Um, I mean, I loved how Saunders, and found this really challenging because I know I would have said this myself, challenging the notion that it is because we are a harsh climate place, that our population is different. Now, I'm from Southern Ontario, but for the past, since 2014, so past 10 years, I've been living, on the prairies. And as any of my friends who drive their kids, from Saskatchewan to a hockey or ringette tournament in Montana or North Dakota will be quick to tell you the fact that where our climate is significantly a different factor, as Saunders mentions, is a little bit of a misnomer. And that concept that to be un-American, is a source of pride, or to be the anti-America. And I liked how Saunders nuanced that. I mean, there's some things that perhaps there's a true thing that we're trying to speak about ourselves when we raise that up as a source of pride. But yeah, that idea that in times of great migration, Canada was simultaneously welcoming people from Europe while sending more people than welcoming, into the States was for me like a really challenging and interesting, concept. But yeah, moderator, I don't know, how it's challenged sort of some of your perceptions or the things that you had been brought up thinking about or thought about.
Yeah, I also was it completely like reframed, as you said, what I learned in high school social studies. Um, and I found it's become a filter by like through which I'm going back and rethinking um, some of the things that I understood to be true. Um, and also some of the things that I think for some Canadians maybe made a lot of sense, but to me as an Indigenous person didn't
Mm.
make sense. And so I was telling Cam earlier, um, I moved to Texas when I was 17 to study flute performance and orchestral studies. I'm just full of surprises. Um, I never finished my music degree, and came home after 2 years. But as most of you know, I did my PhD in California. And so um, after we had Gabriel and I got married, I decided it was really important to me that I wanted to have the same passport as my kids. And so rather than just live on my green card as an Indigenous person in the US, I became a dual citizen and was really confronted by the vociferous feelings of some of my friends in Vancouver who almost treated me like I was traitorous for how could you possibly become an American? And I think I actually said to one of my best friends, like, same colonial context, different country. Like I'm exercising my Indigenous right as my Jay Treaty right as an Indigenous person to see the border as something that was imposed on us and not therefore not relevant to me. And I celebrate the fact that I have the right to live and work and study in both countries without impediment. But hadn't really seen how strong that anti-American sentiment was, because most of the time it just was sort of like under the surface. And so like going back and rethinking some of those conversations, or and I think also realizing just how small Canada was until the mid-century too. How much we've grown. And Alan was just saying, well, Cam and Alan and I were getting set up for tonight, that also the assumptions in this book from 5 years ago when it was written have been a little bit shattered, because our population is now 42 million, right? And they were talking, and I think in the book he was talking about getting to 32 million by now, and no, 36 million. So yeah, it's just given me a different lens to look at the way that we talk about the way that we've talked about our history, and how strong the myth of the one country, two nations is, and how for how long that actually hasn't been true. But it's also I read this book and was thinking, yeah, I see this also in the church, though, these cultural pushes and pulls and minimizing and maximizing tendencies in our churches. So I think that's the next thing that Cam and I we're going to talk about.
Yeah, we were thinking about how what potential takeaways does this book offer us for the church? Yeah, and I was thinking about that idea of like what minimizing impulses he identifies throughout Canadian history. So restrictive immigration, ethnic homogeneity, extractive economic policy, a view of Indigenous communities as problems, not partners, restricted relationships with the United States, and a shortage of people. And then he contrasts that later in the book with when Canada has had maximizing impulse, either when there's been these moments or where we might be able to pick it up. The idea that pluralism and ethnic heterogeneity, broad source immigration aimed at expansion, diversified value-added economy, open North American trade, and continental integration, Indigenous nations as sovereign partners, a view of society as a collection of individuals and a growing population. And I was thinking about, might we say that in some ways, United Church, or sometimes some of our particular congregations, have a minimizing impulse, and in what way are some of these things, maybe particularly like the homogeneity, and our image of who we are, and that we are a particular kind of person, and that wondering and being concerned about other different kinds of people, who don't maybe hold the all often quoted but hard to point at United Church ethos. That is perhaps a minimizing impulse for us.
Sorry. There was something that I read on page 114 and 115. when he was talking about the ways in which, especially in Toronto and Montreal, the school systems became much more multilingual and multicultural, like even before the late 1960s, under the first Trudeau prime minister, where that got named as such, and sort of we think of Trudeau as sort of like the first prime minister to push for multiculturalism. But he talks about in an early 1960s report titled Immigrants and Their Education, the school board concluded that it should be, quote, providing an education for a multicultural student population, using a word that was not yet a part of the political vocabulary, one built on a system of mutual accommodation of give and take, in which both established Canadians and immigrants have the ability and the responsibility to adjust their civic lenses. I read that and I thought, well, that's like really what we said to ourselves in Thunder Bay in 2006 at General Council when we made the decision to become an intentionally intercultural church, was that we needed to adjust the lenses through which we saw each other as sort of the more heritage settler, British and Francophone communities of like this mythological Canada that we got taught in high school social studies, versus being able to be willing to be transformed and have a more give and take relationship with people who come from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds than ourselves, and being willing to be transformed by that interaction and not just recognizing each other's difference. So one thing that I noticed though is that like he kind of makes some allusions to like really overtly racist things. Like Sir Wilfrid Laurier thought that different European cultures were okay, but different races were not, and things like that. But he doesn't, it'd be interesting to like go back and reread this with a sort of anti-racism lens, because he really doesn't address it. And I think that that's also something, you know, like he tells the truth sort of about the oppression of Indigenous people, but he doesn't like mention the Indian Act, and it's like, well, they were viewed as an inferior race, but doesn't talk, and he talks about the impact of residential schools, but not that like the residential schools were actually an intentional way to like solve or eradicate the Indian problem in Canada. So I feel like, you know, which is maybe to be expected by a middle-class white guy writing the book, but so that I found that that was the one part that was sort of missing for me is,
Yeah.
so you can talk about like the demographics and the population and the cultural, like the views of new Canadians, whether it's from a minimizing or a maximizing perspective, but he doesn't like anywhere address the legacies of how that actually bolsters racism in Canada. So maybe we're a little bit further ahead than Doug Saunders on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, I was saying to the moderator that I read this on a couple plane trips on my way to Ontario, first to London. So yeah, funny to be on my way to London and to read a book about how we're really attached to our British heritage. And then moving on to Ottawa. And when I was in Ottawa, amongst the things that I was doing, apart from getting to participate in the flourishing workshop that was there, I was also getting to meet with someone named Isa. So Isa is one of the leaders of one of the new communities amongst migrant and diasporic folk that the United Church is seeking to support and seeking to help nurture. And so Isa leads up a group of Swahili speakers in Ottawa who are worshiping together, building community together. And the things that he speaks about, that Saunders talks about, in terms of the challenges that folks are facing, and that if we're not preparing ourselves for making space for people, really came through so clearly in my conversation with Isa about the challenges that his community, most of whom are from DRC and from Malawi, folks who have come in the last just couple of years, facing the sort of same issues that Saunders names about, and how those factors keep new communities isolated, but they have a deep longing to find a space and to participate and to contribute. And that's so prevalent in Isa's community, both in terms of Ottawa as a whole and what they hope they would be able to bring into a church community as they explore what the United Church of Canada is and how they might integrate in. So and the potential gifts that are there. And as the moderator said before about about our willingness and our interest to be transformed and to learn and to find something exciting. I remember there was a quote in there that I found quite interesting. I mean, in this case, Saunders was talking about the US influence, but I think on page 49, he talks about seeing change and growth as a threat and rather than an opportunity. And this opportunity to say like, oh, these folks who are wanting to come, wanting to integrate, we could learn so much and how we might be transformed and how we might be enriched in our own life, rather than worried about whether the thing that we think is fundamentally true and most important about ourselves and our communities would be changed and could be lost.
Yeah, I think one of the things Cam and I talked about earlier is I guess one of the implications or outcomes of the minimizing tendencies in Canada is that we are a very risk-averse person or country, or we are a risk-averse people, and that there's this tendency to like want to wait until all the conditions are perfect to take to the next step. And that's something that both of us are seeing in our travels across the church, is that rather than preparing to build the thing that you want to see happen and to prepare for the future that you want to create, we're waiting for, rather than, and Cam can talk about his experience of this in congregational ministry, but for an example is rather than hiring paid Sunday school teachers to create space for children to come to church, we wait for the children to come to church as proof that we need that. And then that can be to our detriment sometimes. And one of the things that we talked about in the Flourishing Project in Halifax last April was we had a keynote speaker, Andre Picard from the Globe and Mail, and he talked about how we have this sort of tendency as Canadians, one, to focus on bad news. He said, like, there's you see it every day in the media in Canada that our healthcare system is failing us and for XYZ things. And he's like, and actually the data shows that that's just not true, right? We have better health outcomes, better standard of living. I mean, COVID changed that a little bit, and the opioid crisis is changing that a little bit, but that for the most part, we have better, faster, more sophisticated access to healthcare across this country than we ever have at any point in Canadian history. And that we've always had a combination of public and private healthcare. And that where we need to worry about a two-tiered system is not whether it's public or private, but the implications of the rural-urban experience in Canada, and that we have, because of some of these histories of not having enough people across massive massive pieces of land across the country, that we don't have the medical infrastructure anymore to support rural communities, and that's where the biggest risk is. And he's like, but we also have this bad habit of writing reports to solve our problems and having really successful pilot programs, and then saying that that was just a pilot program, like we couldn't actually implement those changes at scale, or it would disrupt things too much. And so we have all the solutions to our problems sitting in binders on people's shelves in policymakers' offices, and we just don't adopt them. So, you know, and I think about that unwillingness to change, or as really like a cultural dynamic of Canadians to be risk averse. And to me, that's like more gracious than maybe just saying some people are not willing to change. Like, I think it actually is a cultural piece for Canadians that we're risk averse. I saw it on my board at First United, and I think that to have big audacious dreams and to build something that seems scary to other people is actually a really hard thing to do in Canada. So.
Yeah, that idea that it's kind of a part of, you know, that it's not just a simple matter of like each individual just thinking like, oh, it's like let's just be braver, or you know, let's try anything, but that recognizing, and I think this lays out in such an interesting way how that's been woven into the fabric and into the collective psyche of who we are. Um, I remember there's this if everyone is aware of like the new monastic movement, there's a prayer liturgy called or a common prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals, and lovely little book, and there's a lunchtime prayer, and it begins with draw us into your love and deliver us from fear. And I remember thinking when I first like pick it up, feeling like why don't we just like forget the deliver from fear? Why don't we just be braver? And like that idea of like how we sometimes get like stuck in this collective way of being that just is mutually reinforced. And that it's not just a matter of pull ourselves up and out of it, but that we get stuck, and we need something to help us do that. I mean, I don't want to pull too much from the Flourishing Project, but that's one of the things as well about that, like about getting stuck in sort of a spoiler alert, but not too much of a spoiler alert, teaser alert. Come to the Flourishing Project when it's in the locality nearest you, because there's an excellent analogy of living above the line and below the line, and where we're stuck in the bad news, where things feel like a threat, versus in a space above the line where we're able to view with a level of creativity. But that we do get kind of stuck there, and the stories we tell ourselves about the moment that we are in, get us there, and the need to start a different kind of conversation, I think, within our church is a pretty important one. And I think we see, as Saunders points out here, and as we're seeing play out in some really scary ways within the news, like the potential for negative stories to drag us down into scary places when we don't allow and watch for it is pretty prevalent.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I really appreciated with the book is just thinking, you know, given this history of at first the British colonialist like attachment to just being a resource extraction tool to support the empire, and specifically the British Empire, and how much our population was limited, and how much the Indigenous population was decimated from the early years of Canada, like, and how massive our country is, that it's really kind of a miracle that we made it at all. Like, that we didn't just become subsumed into the United States and like more westward and northward expansion from the US. Like, it often does feel like we don't have enough people in enough places across the country, and yet we're so, like, you know, so much like exponentially bigger than we were 60 years ago. And you know, I can see it in the difference between being in most Canadian cities now compared to when I grew up, right? Like, I would spent most of my childhood either in Alert Bay or which is a very small island that used to have 2,000 people on it, and it's divided exactly in half between the white end and the indigenous end. Well, they actually still call it the white end or the Indian end. And then the rest of my childhood I spent in Oak Bay, which is they describe that particular neighborhood of Victoria as being behind the Tweed Curtain and being more British than the British. And like there was exactly 2 of us that were indigenous in my high school and 2 Black kids. And I think there might have been like 4 Asian kids in my high school of 2,000 people. So maybe that was very true, but I think it's more and more common now to have friends and neighbors, and we have whole little enclaves within cities of these different populations of folks, and it's something that I have like noticed as I've traveled so much of the country in the last 2 years, how much diversity there is in the country. And having to fight my own minimizing tendencies because, of course, every time I think about how many millions of people are moving here for very good reasons from other places, I think that's millions more people that we have to teach the history of colonization of Canada and the impacts on Indigenous people and fight the stigmatization of like the existing prejudice about Indigenous people that exist in this country. And because I've had the opportunity through the World Council of Churches and the United Church of Canada to travel all over the world and to see the contexts that some people are coming to Canada from. And I think that John Ralston Saul talks about in his book, The Comeback, that part of what makes Canada Canada and not the United States was the first couple of 100 years of like really productive relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous settlers, who like where there was welcome and integration into our communities. And so I can see within Indigenous Canada a rising nationalism and minimizing tendency within Indigenous communities, both in terms of like kind of like readopting or reasserting the whole or trying to claim the right to say who is Indigenous and members of a particular tribal group, in part as a reaction to all of the like pretendian stuff that's happening, but also like saying that because the Indian Act and how it defines Indians legally is broken, that we're going to move to like the American blood quantum system, which was like an American imposition, didn't actually have anything to do with how our communities integrated or not with each other. And so, and I think that we're going to see more and more and more climate refugees coming to North America. And the Canadian government, I've also heard, is preparing for how do we make life sustainable sort of north of 60 in like the very highly unpopulated parts of Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're talking about integrating people into like learning the history of subjugation and violence and fighting the stigma that so easily can be created. The Multicultural Society of Saskatchewan, remember being at one of their meetings several years ago when I was still in congregational ministry, and they were noting that within a week of people arriving in Regina, refugee or immigrant, they were already able to be told or to be able to repeat back, don't go into North Central, because that's the primarily Indigenous neighborhood. It took a week, and some people were saying like as early as then people were being asked to reflect back where they had picked that up, and some as early as the person who stamped at the airport the paperwork to get through to pick up your baggage was where people were being told that there's certain spots in Regina that you don't go because that's who is there. And so such a present issue.
Yeah. There was another thing that came up for me, but maybe I just was looking back. I want to hear, I think we should open up for discussion just because we're a smaller group. And also I think some of the comments that I've seen, I don't, I want to have discussion about what's coming up in the chat. Cam, I'm also seeing that I think maybe you're not speaking close enough into the microphone. And so for the transcription for people who need the audio help isn't
Oh no, it's fine.
coming
You're
through
good.
super well. Is it
You got
better?
it sorted. Yeah. It's all
Okay,
good.
good.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. So there was a couple of folks around, like, how would the book be written if we applied the lens of donut economics to 100 million people goal? And I thought there's some really good pieces in the book around like how we build our cities and the fact that we have, I think it's like 68% of our global greenhouse gas emissions in Canada come from stationary combustion, which is like heating and cooling our buildings. And so his points around density and not having urban sprawl and single family homes as being like a really key factor in how we prepare for a population that size without continuing to have the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the world. We don't have the highest total greenhouse gas emissions because of course India and China we're a small tiny fraction of their populations. But we do have the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the world. And most of that comes from heating and cooling buildings. And then I think I remember the other thing that I was thinking about is one of the things that I've preached many times and shared many times through the Flourishing Project is a great one-liner that I heard, I don't know, it was before we started our capital campaign at First United Church in Vancouver, because it's in the video for the capital campaign. But it's very, very common in the United Church of Canada, especially in affirming congregations, to say all are welcome here, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in life's journey, no matter where you're from, no matter who you love, you are welcome here. And so the confrontation to that I heard was, there's a difference between saying all are welcome here and this was designed with you in mind. Right? Like saying all are welcome here is that you're welcome to come and be like us. Whereas if I've designed your experience with you in mind, that means that I've thought through if I need to have ASL interpretation or English language support or mobility access to a building or hearing. I've been to some congregations where they still have hearing aids for where the sound gets amplified for people whose their own hearing aids are not adequate for the space and the audio, like acoustic dynamics in the congregation, that have created spaces that are welcoming and fun and safe for children. And we just did the Flourishing Project in Montreal, and we had simultaneous translation, and I would say it was like only probably about 5 or 6% of the participants were francophone. But it was really important for me to model that, not just saying like, oh, you're welcome here and we'll try and raise your hand if you don't understand something that I said to you in English, versus I'm going to make this event language accessible to you as a French person because I'm in your province, and it's very likely there's going to be people that speak French that want to come to this. And so and then we had a hardware issue, and so we ended up just switching to sequential translation. So I would speak a sentence or two and then the interpreters would translate. And I think that that's one of the things that is a hoped for outcome from the affirming process in terms of how we define and embody welcome, but that we haven't got it down pat yet. Right? That we really do mean that you're welcome to come and to be like us in how we treat each other when we walk through the door. I don't think that that's how we like to think about it, but you know, when I think back to Emerging Spirit and the massive investment that we made in that project and had really engaged communities of like tens of thousands of Canadians across the country talking about spirituality and faith, and then the few that did use the church finder to come and find a United Church congregation, their feedback was, I did not experience the same welcome or depth of or quality of conversation in the churches that I did online. And so it wasn't for me. So yeah, I don't know where I was going to go with that. I didn't land the plane on that one. But I know what it was. That there's, you know, he talks about having on page 211, Cam sent me this quote: any 100 million plan is probably best rejected if Canada is not prepared to make investments and take precautions in advance to ensure the system continues to function well. And there's that, again, that idea of designing something with people in mind. Like, if we know that 100 million is a better number for us than 42 million, then like, what can we do now to design our infrastructure, to design our political engagement, to design our welcome with the people that we want to welcome in mind, rather than recruiting warm bodies and then resenting them when they get here. So that goes back to Carol's comment. She said racism is what the book was about in her opinion, and I agree. I think it's just very understated. It wasn't explicit. So maybe we'll look at it. I did take us to 415. All right. So does anybody want to just say more about their comment that they've typed into the chat? I see one from Marg, one from Ian, Karen, and Kate and Carol.
Feel free to raise your digital hand, folks, so I can see you and I can ask you to unmute and pop you on the screen.
All right, let's go with Mark.
I fully understand that the need that we have to do in terms of transportation planning. I'm an old highway planner before I was anything else. And I understand that we need to have better schools, and we do actually need better health care. I'm sorry, you actually do. We do need to revamp all of that. We do have good stuff, but it does need to be, because we are an aging population. So he doesn't, I mean, he says we don't want people just so we can deal with the aging population, but he never ever mentions the climate crisis. And any growth that we have, I mean, you can talk about refugees that we're going to have coming in, but that's not sufficient. We actually have to deal with our infrastructure and how we're going to deal with that. Like, it's significant. This is not something to be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he does have a section on the ecological crisis. So can you say more about, like, so I think on page 173, it sounds like he's making an argument that having more people will actually make it easier to build efficiency rather than our current way of doing things.
And I mean, he sounds a bit like Doug Ford at times, in terms of we need more housing, so we'll just wipe out the green belt. That's my concern, is that the way of protecting the ecology, the way of dealing with the climate crisis has to be done in an orderly manner. And it can't be at the cost of farmland. Like, I am concerned that we're going to lose more farmland, and for some reason we don't want to intensify anything. Is that
we don't want to intensify what?
We don't want to intensify our buildings, or, like, you know, I don't want to you know, I've got a 1 acre lot. I don't want to put anything else on it, right?
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's true, like single family homes and high rises are not the only two options. Right? Like we can have like way more fourplexes and sixplexes that are energy efficient, where we've taken you know, gas burning, diesel burning heating systems out of them, moved to heat pumps, geothermal, hydro, whatever. Like there we have the ability to develop housing that is significantly more sustainable than what we've done, and also build out of different products, right? Like in Vancouver, we're starting to see more investment in tall wood buildings, where we've taken cross laminated timber, which is great because it's a value added BC grown timber product and is just as fire safe as concrete. And to be able to build buildings, because concrete and steel, I think, make up like 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions just to produce
Concrete is bad.
the product. So, you know, I think this is one of the areas where we need to push back on that Canadian risk aversion, and our government, and especially the civil servants, need to push harder on developing public policies to like pull the rest of us along with them, because you know, public policies can be developed in response to public need, but sometimes the reason why we have specialized civil servants is because they're the professionals we entrust to tell us what's the next right thing. And I'm not talking about politicians, I'm talking about like the
But he made the point that we can't both have the policymakers that are part of the civil service and the people that are going to deliver it. We don't have the support. We don't have the capacity to do that within the civil service. You have to make up your mind where you're going to get your policy from, and then either have the civil service doing that or have them deliver it. And we expect it to do it all. And that's what we've always expected.
yeah.
And we can't carry on with that. We do not have sufficient people.
Mhm. Well, I think one of the, so there's another couple of comments in here about the anti-immigrant sentiment that's already been exploited in politics. And, you know, I think I'm not, I wasn't meaning to represent Andre Picard as saying we have no health crisis. It's not that he's not acknowledging that we don't have a health crisis. He's saying that we have all the answers already. We're just not willing to implement them. And, you know, I think sometimes when I'm like taking a step back and looking at the whole country and thinking, well, if I was the boss of the world, I would say if you are, I used to play a game when I was in my 20s. I took a lot of taxis for some reason. I don't know. Then the bus service in Vancouver was really unpredictable and unreliable. And I never once had a taxi driver that had less than a master's degree. And so if I was the boss of the world and I looked at our medical system and I looked at the fact that we have new Canadians who are generally willing to be settled anywhere in the country, I would say anybody who's got their medical education from, you know, a Commonwealth country or from the US should automatically just be able to be a doctor in Canada. And if you come from a culture or medical practice that is radically different, why couldn't we do something similar to what lawyers do, where you have to do, you know, like a 1-year certificate to get you up to date on what the standards of medical practice are in Canada, and then redo your residency, and then that's it. That's like, you don't have to, but we tell people that not only do we not recognize all of their decades of experience and their sometimes postgraduate degrees in medicine, but that they have to go back and redo their undergrad, like, because they don't have a proper British education or proper Canadian education. And so we have people driving Uber and working in Tim Hortons that are doctors. And you know, I think that if you could, I don't know how you would do it, but like have community roundtables about like what's important and how, what, like how do we need to shift in order to balance all of these competing pressures and take advantage of the expertise and knowledge of the people that are coming into the country that could help, right? Because there's lots of countries that do lots of things better than us. And so sometimes coming in with like fresh eyes from the outside could be a benefit too, but we don't seem to want to hear that. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, he talked about like the marketing of Canadian immigration. There's a man at the Vancouver School of Theology who is from Colombia, and he was one of our janitors, and he had been in Canada for 30 years when I started my theological education, and I got to know him quite well. And he was a practicing architect in Bogota in like the late 1970s, and was at a bar one night and met a Canadian immigration official who convinced him that Canada needed more architects, more professionals, and would he consider moving to Canada? And so he went home and he talked about his wife with it, and this guy, you know, kept selling him on this idea of moving to Canada. And so he sold his practice in Bogota and packed up his whole family and moved to Vancouver to find out once he got here that not only did they not recognize his certification as an architect, but he would have to go back and do his GED, his undergrad, and his architecture school, which he couldn't afford to do. And so for 30 years when I met him, he'd been working as a janitor at our theological school. And the amount of the lack of coordination about how to welcome the people that we're recruiting into the country, not only the implications on the climate crisis and our healthcare and all of the other and our social safety nets, which are already woefully inadequate, but like the actual like misleading nature of those marketing campaigns to other countries is like massive. Any other comments from or questions from folks in the...
Just a reminder, folks, in order for me to see you, I need you to raise your digital hand. So if you can go down to the React and raise hand, because I can't, I mean, not that it's that many to scroll through all the time, but I don't see everybody all at the same time because I got to have this 2 spotlight, otherwise the recording doesn't look proper. So if you have something to say, please put up your digital hand.
I mean, Cam, maybe while people are collecting their thoughts, do you want to say anything else about like the key takeaways or ways that you see these dynamics showing up in our church more explicitly?
Yeah, happy to do so. I do wonder, Carol, I saw that your thumb went up. Were you waving us down, thumbs up? You had a question you wanted to throw in? Maybe we could go to Carol's question and I can ponder some of that stuff.
Sure. I missed that.
Yeah, folks can flag down other people, type in the chat. Like it's scrolling back and forth all the time is difficult for me. So Carol has a question. Did I ask you to unmute? There you go, try that.
Oh, Carol, you've turned your mic on, but we can't hear you still. Maybe can you type your question into the chat? Okay. Why don't we let you do that and we'll go to Karen Hamilton's question next. And I'm not sure why we can't hear your microphone, but that's unfortunate. Karen.
Yep. And I don't know why we can't hear her microphone either, but I also had great difficulty finding the hand to raise. So, you know, technology, super fun when it works. Not so much a question, but I just wanted to go back to the thing that I had typed a little while ago about the, to which you responded, Carmen, about the study guide for new immigrants and refugees coming to Canada, and the fact that it has a really excellent, in not being an expert, but in my humble opinion, excellent section on First Nations, Indigenous realities in Canada and technology and language. And it's a really, and it's substantive. It's a huge percentage of the citizenship guide. And so, and I've heard a number of Indigenous folk talk about this and say that the people my generation, not speaking for any of us else on the screen, but my generation should be talking to are either refugees, new immigrants who have become Canadian citizens because they've studied this, or kids in high school because they're getting fairly substantive learning as well. So that's really interesting to see that we've got these two sectors in the population that know more than many of the rest of us do. But the experience of studying with my Syrian friend was she took it very seriously, that this was part of Canada. And obviously she was not here during residential school era. She was new to learning about many of the things that are happening and the naming of land and treaties. But she said, this is part of the country. And if I'm going to become a Canadian, this is something I need to be very engaged with and understand and you know, participate in reconciliation. So I said that in a shorter version in the chat, but what I also wanted to mention was, and some of you will know, and Carmen does, and Marion does, that I spent 15 years of probably the most substantive ministry of my life as General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. And that's 26 member denominations representing most of the Christians in Canada. Only 4 of those 26 denominations had residential schools. So we had a number of sessions looking at we had many sessions, you know, almost every one, but looking at the impact of residential schools and all of the other ways in which, you know, Indigenous realities have been, you know, suppressed and brutalized in Canada. And the other denominations, some of whom weren't in the country until quite recently either, like the Martoma from India, places like that, they also took it very seriously and said, when we came to Canada, this is, you know, this is part of becoming a Canadian, is to take the responsibility of reconciliation seriously. And we didn't have residential schools. So then, what is our role? What can our role be as those who are sisters and brothers in Christ, but who didn't technically have residential schools, but are Canadians in this landscape and wanting to work towards truth and reconciliation? And so it was a really, really interesting process to be a part of. And a lot of them took very substantive roles and actions in supporting truth and reconciliation, even though they had not even been here or had not had residential schools, either because they couldn't or because they thought they were wrong.
Yeah, that's helpful and hopeful. I was really happy to hear that call to action, that the resources be made available to people studying for citizenship in Canada had been implemented. And it's good to hear that it's also a worthwhile thing, because when I heard that it had been implemented, I imagined it was like 2 pages in the book. So maybe me not necessarily assuming positive intent.
I'm noting Ian had I see Carol's there. Maybe we can go to Carol's, and then I noticed that Ian's asked that we kind of address something that he's written in there. Recent government moves to blame and limit foreign students due to their impact on homelessness, lack of housing. This is one of the reasons that the book made such an impact on me. Looking for people to blame doesn't make up for history and certainly doesn't build houses.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the seeing the way that Borden kind of jumped on the white nationalism train during the race riots in Vancouver had a big impact on me, in the way that sometimes our what was one of the ways it was described from a historical document? Priggish xenophobia can gets politicized, right? Like, so there's already existing sentiments or fears around cultural difference, and then our politicians can either make it better or worse. And you know, we certainly see it. One of the things that impacted me from the book is seeing the way that the pendulum swung between the maximizing and minimizing effects. And so when Alan mentioned that, you know, one of the things, so I guess the book was written in 2017, not 2019. So it's 7 years old now. And so seeing that we've already, you know, exceeded the population growth target by 20% or something from what was projected at the time that Saunders wrote the book, then now we start to see like the backlash against that because it feels like too much too fast, and immigrants are to blame for the things that are like wrong in our things that are wrong in our society. And I was thinking back to this whole dynamic of like being Canadian and anti-American, and the ways, and because I've lived back and forth between the two countries for most of my adult life. In my view, Canada's always like 10 to 15 years behind American political tendencies. And I was thinking back to when I first moved to California, Stephen Colbert had done a skit on, he went and joined like a tomato picking farm in North Carolina and like went and picked tomatoes for the day. And he was working alongside all the migrant workers, both documented and undocumented, and seeing how hard they work. And he was like, please, please, please open our borders. Like, don't ever make me have to go pick tomatoes ever again. If they're stealing their jobs, they can have them. Like, that is the worst job I've ever had in my entire life. And but we have this North American, I would say, mythology or stigma that like immigrants are stealing the good jobs, when we actually actively limit people to jobs that most Canadians, most Americans don't necessarily want to take. And so that backlash is definitely like starting to be present in terms of blaming the numbers of Canadian students that are coming to study in our institutions. And it'll be interesting to see what the impact of that is, because we charge so much more tuition for foreign students. And I guarantee you that our universities are depending on the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars that foreign students pay to our schools. And so I wouldn't be surprised like 3 years from now to start seeing like budget cuts in faculties, and like the impact of not having those students. And it also feels punitive because this like limit on students in the news came right on the heels of the studies showing how few permanent residents are becoming citizens, right? Or how few students are actually staying in Canada, that they don't want to stay in Canada because it doesn't, like, the quality of life here isn't significantly better than where they came from. So there's lots of stuff to sort out about that.
Yeah,
oh, look at you go, Cam. You put the immigration study. I'm going to download it.
Yeah, seriously, there it is,
Oh,
folks,
see it.
in regular and large print PDF. Yeah, I was really reflecting on this past conversation on page 206. He really addresses that sort of that kind of myth that Canada were the naturally tolerant ones. I think he says there's no cause for complacency. Widespread support for immigration and multiculturalism didn't come about because established Canadians were naturally inclined to embrace minorities. It arose because despite initial misgivings, the systems worked. Canadians watched immigrants who arrived as mysterious and disturbed strangers become their palpably Canadian colleagues and neighbors. And then goes on to say that the biggest danger is something will interrupt or block that process. For example, a sharp change in the economy, political culture, or the geography of cities could cause a political backlash. And I've got that like I think I've got like could exclamation mark double underlined in my margins there, being like, I think we're seeing some major things that could block or dismiss. But was thinking about this in relation to the work that I get to do, and the work that our department is about, in the deep interest in Protestants from Africa, and Methodists from worldwide denominations who are here in Canada and who have an interest in finding whether there is a place for them within the United Church of Canada, whether this is the Zimbabwean United Methodist Church, whether this is a Methodist Church of Zimbabwe in Canada, the Church of Jesus Christ of Madagascar, all folks with these Methodist roots who have such an interest in whether the United Church of Canada could be their people here, and what a neat opportunity that is, and what an interesting opportunity. I think for all of our whether we fear that, it's like, well, what about this part of who we treasure within the United Church, or that part of who we treasure, and will that be there? Rather than thinking about what might we gain to learn, what may we gain to grow, and that these are, I believe, intensely compatible with the other commitments that we have made, that we deeply treasure, and for good reason. And that we have this opportunity to be this really excellent space of witnessing against that sort of narrative that Ian, you're mentioning, and that others have, Carol, you as well, to do that. Because it's when it works is where the narratives of fear no longer have their power. Sorry, the rest of my family just came inside. I don't know if you heard a herd of elephants come in.
No. I heard like one child's voice very briefly. I think that I wish that people across the church would read this book and use it as a way to examine the dynamics in our own church. I was sharing with Cam before we started that, or maybe earlier today. I think many of you know I started this Regenerate Leadership Development program as part of our invigorating leadership priority in the church. And so I'm working with a cohort of 32 ministry personnel from across the country. And we're meeting in residence 6 times over 18 months, 4 times in person and twice online for week-long study periods together. And one of the participants, their congregation just became affirming a few years ago. Their congregation also had sponsored a Ugandan refugee family and welcomed that family with open arms. And as that family got integrated into the community where they had moved to, into the city where they had moved, they met other West African refugees, specifically other Ugandan refugees. And because they had felt so welcomed in their church, they said, well, why don't you come to church with us? And which was fine until it was a noticeable number. And the ethos and practice and experience of worship in different countries is really different. I remember the first time I went to a World Council of Churches prayer service in Brazil, and I turned to Aruna Ganaditson, who was one of the senior leaders on the World Council of Churches at the time, and I was like, people are being so rude. They're just talking through everything, and oh my goodness. And she said, oh, you poor Canadian, like this is how most of the rest of the world worships. Like we get so, it's really disconcerting for us when we come to your churches because everything's so silent, you could hear a pin drop. And so as more and more of the West African community have started worshiping in this congregation, it's really starting to create this tension that exists because the affirming welcome that the congregation imagined was the kind of welcome where you can come and be like us, not a welcome where we've designed it with West Africans in mind. And so now the board chair has requested that the minister teach a class on like worship etiquette to teach people how they should worship if they're expecting to come to worship in a United Church congregation. And they said, well, also the region's now become a fully affirming region, and so can't they go worship somewhere else? And I thought, like, what a horrible example of the way that this minimizing tendency shows up in our churches, right? And I've talked about this before in sermons that I've preached around especially the congregations that can still afford 3/4 or full-time ministry personnel, but won't hire somebody from the admissions list. And they say like, well, I'm not racist, but I can't understand what she's saying, or I just can't understand what she's saying. and that we aren't willing to welcome people who have been called and assessed and tested and assessed as ready by the church and by the admissions board and our candidacy boards to serve our church, and we won't hire them because they're not enough like us. And I think that that's like unfortunate, and something that we have, like, one of the big questions that we have to rumble with as a denomination. And you know, I see the ways in which that British colonial mindset still gets privileged in the church. Somebody came up to me at Berwick this summer and said, "Moderator, I want to push back on what you said, because we are ministers of the word. And if you can't communicate the word, how can you minister? How can you be a minister of the word?" And the context matters. And so you can't have somebody who's an English as a second language speaker come in and not be understood. And I said, well, I think that's a very narrow view of things. Like, you know, look at our colleague Miriam Spies, for example, in Horseshoe Falls Regional Council. She lives with cerebral palsy. She has a speech impediment as part of that. And she knows that sometimes she can be difficult to understand. And so she preaches from full text, and she provides printed copies of her sermon at the door so that people can follow along. And how is that not preaching the word? And he said, I think that's an excellent example. And in my view, she has no business in the pulpit. She should stick to writing books. And, you know, like, it's heartbreaking the ways in which that minimizing temptation can hurt us more than it protects us. And so if I have, you know, I think that there are challenges and problems with the maximizing piece too, but, you know, Cam, I'm wondering if you want to add anything about where you see signs of hope when the church is, you know, because your team are engaging with folks across a whole spectrum of experiences in terms of ministry renewal and development. So when we can get over that minimizing tendency, where do you see the signs of hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one incredible, so I mean, I sort of alluded to it before, but the scale at which worldwide Methodists and African Protestants are interested in learning about the United Church of Canada and finding a way to connect and believing that there's something that is rich and beautiful to share and wanting to the call to deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice, and the commitment to try to reach out beyond past borders has really resonated with many of these communities. And I think there's a really amazing opportunity. There's a few spaces in which those groups are kind of building themselves, you know, working within their own communities, and then in some spaces where there's these communities existing within the established congregation. And I think the anecdote that the moderator shared about worship etiquette is, you know, is playing out in some places. So there's some concern there, but where people are able to embrace some of that, they're finding just great joy and opportunity. Recently, hearing about a congregation, you know, in United States in the East, who just through their minister having a door opened when people were accessing immigration support services that were offered within the church by external agencies, getting to meet some of the new families from Africa in particular who were coming into access services, and then finding those folks coming to worship and them being able to resist that kind of urge that I think is incredibly common to do that and to embrace the different possibilities that were there. The church that I served in Regina shortly after I got here um, was renting space to the Eritrean Orthodox church, and people were very, when I arrived, very lamenting the lack of young people, the lack of energy, about we used to be able to put on these amazing lunches, but we can't anymore. And you know what that Eritrean community brought with them? It was a ton of young people, a ton of energy, and some pretty darn good lunches. But the fact that they didn't show up in the way and with the flavor palette that people were thinking about really caused a lot of anxiety, and it was too much for that group to pay over. So I think where people are, where communities are able to see a possibility and say yes to it, is incredibly powerful. A community in the prairies who have said yes to the possibility of co-locating within their congregation a new outreach ministry to the campus of the local Polytechnic Institute nearby, and people saying yes to those opportunities. I remember reading Turning Ourselves Inside Out by Rob Fennell and Russell Day, and they speak about the double no, the no to the decline that they were feeling, and then no to every possible solution to it. And the courage to say yes and to try something, to evaluate what that looks like, and then to explore. Where we're seeing it is incredibly positive.
Thanks, Cam. Just before we wrap up, does anybody have a burning desire to add anything to the discussion? All right. Probably if you are a regular every month, you've been waiting to hear what the book is for October. I'm like 99.9% sure who's going to discuss it with me, but I'm just going to go ahead and name it that it's going to be the novel Washington Black by Essie Adugian, who's a Black Canadian author. I put the publisher's piece about it in the chat. It is available through the UCRD already. And I'm hoping that Franklin James, who's one of our leaders in the Black Clergy Network in the United Church of Canada, will be the person to discuss it. I reached out to the author, but she was not available to join us. And then in November, our very own Karen Hamilton, who just spoke on this call, is going to be discussing her book, Faith as Protest, as one of the centennial focuses on United Church writers. And really looking forward to that conversation. And then in January, I think we have, I just had it in front of me. In January, we're going to have Hal Llewellyn and our former moderator, the very Reverend Marion Party, are going to discuss Hugh Siegel's book, Bootstraps Need Boots, which is a lone Tory's fight for universal basic income in Canada, which is a fascinating memoir and argument for universal basic income in this country. Marion has been involved in a lot in political advocacy for universal basic income, as has her co-discussant Hal. And yeah, Karen, I'm super excited to talk about your book and also your experience working with the organization that you are involved with in the Holy Land, and just like what's happening right now and how do we do social justice in a respectful way within an interfaith context, and fighting for peace in Palestine and Israel. So those are going to be the next 3 books: Washington Black, Faith as Protest, and Bootstraps Need Boots, all available on UCRD. I also think Alan mentioned really briefly at the beginning, we record these sessions so that you can access them again in ChurchX, either if you want to go back and revisit something, or also so that they become kind of an evergreen resource for your congregations. And so if you wanted to take any or all of the books and do a congregational study, that these conversations and the folks that we've invited to be discussants of the books, maybe not the full conversation, but at least the initial 45 minutes could be a resource to folks if that's helpful in taking some of these books. And it's you know, take it or leave it. It's there so that you can watch it asynchronously, or you can use it as a resource for your congregation. But I really am so grateful to all of you for the ways in which you show up and participate in reading these books for me. With me, not for me. No,
I think
it's
people would
time
do
for
it
me
for
to go
you
to
as
bed.
well. You're very well regarded.
Sort of holding on by a thread here. So. I should also assure the former moderator on this call that I have been taking care of myself. I've had a bad cold for like 3 weeks. It is not COVID, and have sort of been muffling through my travels with a mask and have neocitrin while travel. And so I did take a nap before book club, but it's now bedtime for me tonight. So. Oh, nice feedback. I tried to pick books that I thought would be interesting for us to read, that would have something to say to the church, but might not be the normal things that we read about. And I really love, I'm an interdisciplinarian at heart. I have a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, and I love reading across a broad range of topics, and you know, seeing how we can integrate those thoughts and experiences into our daily lives and into our church. So thanks for coming on the journey with me.
Yeah, this is definitely also one I would not have picked up otherwise, but it's really transformed a lot of the way I'm thinking about the work that our department is undertaking. So I'm really grateful as well for having read it.
Oh, good to know. All right, well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you on October 17th, 6:30 Eastern time. I have no idea. Oh, I'll be back in Toronto by then, so I will be at 6:30 Eastern time. And enjoy Washington Black. It's a novel, so a little bit maybe hopefully a little bit easier to read. Although it's about slavery, so maybe not. So, all right, thanks everybody. We'll see you next month.